am, and you're on the common surface. And we are blessed to have Dr. Joseph B. Farrell with us. Dr. Farrell has published almost 40 books. He has a profound knowledge of history, science, religion, and strange stuff. Joseph is an author of a new book called The Demon in the Ekur, a book about plasmas, angels, pyramids, and their common surfaces. So Joseph's on the line now. Say hi, Joseph.
Howdy, howdy. Thanks for having me back.
You're welcome. This is just a fascinating book, I have to tell you. This Demon in the Ekur book or Acre book,
Mm-hmm.
it is really, it is a set of questions I have had in my mind for as long as I can remember that
Mm-hmm.
nobody was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and in ways that I would never have thought to talk about them, mind you. But just the questions of immateriality, materiality, the spirit world,
Mm-hmm.
angels, the whole nine yards, and its connection to sort of the material world
Uh-huh.
and us, right? So this is just really fascinating stuff. And it's interesting that you went back to the patristic tradition
Uh-huh.
to start the dialogue that's in the book.
Uh-huh.
Do you have a comment on that?
Well, yeah, I'm like you. This was a book I wanted to write for a very long time. In fact, I had the title of the book, The Demon in the Ekur, is taken from a quotation of Zechariah Sitchin that appears in his Earth Chronicles in the volume that's titled The Wars of Gods and Men. And I used that quotation as an epigraph in the first version of the Giza Death Star book, way, way back when I got into this whole alternative publication writing career. And when I sent the book off to a publisher, I kept crunching numbers, and the publisher came back ultimately and rejected the book. And I'm glad in the process that he did, because I took that epigraph out of the revised book that I sent off to Adventures Unlimited. So the epigraph did not appear in the revision of the work, and the reason it didn't is that I thought, okay, this pyramid weapon hypothesis I've got going is already crazy enough. We don't need to be adding demons into the mix.
Right.
So I got rid of it, but in the back of my head, I'm kind of like you. I thought, okay, sooner or later, somebody is going to start probing the hypothesis that these plasmas that exist, they exist in thunderstorms, they exist in deep space, they're all around us, certainly in stars and so on. Sooner or later, somebody is going to write about the hypothesis of plasma life. And the case in point here is the well-known, very famous plasma and quantum physicist David Bohm.
Right.
He's well known to anybody that's ever studied quantum mechanics for his hidden variable version of the theory. So David Bohm, ceased working in plasmas because he came to the conclusion that they might be alive. And this was widely known to people in the physics community, but it was not well publicized as to why he thought that. So, back when I wrote the books, I thought, okay, sooner or later somebody's going to talk about plasma life hypothesis. I've been dancing around plasmas pretty much in every book that I've written that has to deal with alternative physics, from the Nazi Bell to the Philadelphia experiment. They've all got a plasma in them somewhere. So this book was caused by the appearance of Robert Temple's book, The New Science of Heaven. And this book of Temple is entirely devoted to the plasma life hypothesis. It's a wonderful book. However, like so many moderns, he has little to no time and absolutely no inclination to investigate any sort of traditional Christianity and what it might have to say for the hypothesis. He's more interested in showing how the hypothesis links to our good old friend Gnosticism. Well, baloney, I think. I, I think if you're going to take that approach, you have to consult what has been said in the patristic literature about angelic life forms. So in the book, I start out the book with a very lengthy quotation from a church father an Arab church father by the name of Saint John of Damascus. He is a hugely important church father. He is cited by Eastern Orthodox, by medieval Latin scholastics like Aquinas or Albertus Magnus, and so on and so forth. I'm getting a bit of feedback on my end. But anyway, I decided to start it there because I quite frankly I just get sick and tired of the modern world galloping and somersaulting into Gnosticism without doing the slightest bit of investment in the traditional Christian literature from that era. When you do look at Saint John of Damascus, he says some truly astonishing things. There's just no other way to put it.
Yeah, well, I was listening to a Joe Rogan podcast
Yes.
with Diana Walsh Pasulka.
Uh
She's a
huh.
professor at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington,
Uh huh.
and you know, this is a person, who's got a PhD in religious studies, who is basically an atheist,
Right. Right.
and has, spent her whole life and is fascinated by and is diligent about studying all these religions, looking for their common factors.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, she seems to miss the entire point.
Well, that's what happens when you get modern PhDs out of the American Academy. They go out of their way to inculcate all the techniques of ridicule and so on and so forth. I'm well familiar with what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a kind of scholarship that exists in this country that cannot see the forest for the trees.
So why do you think the patristic tradition has been suppressed?
Why do I think it's been suppressed?
Yeah.
Well, because number one, because it goes against virtually every tenet of the modern credo. It's not materialistic. It does not believe in a God in general, which, pretty much everybody in the modern world can agree to. It is adamantly, unabashedly Christian. And it is Christian in such a way that the teaching of the incarnation itself is used, please hear my words, it's used as a way of thinking. So in other words, we're not dealing with philosophy. We're not concerned with trying to solve the problem of predestination and free will in the abstract. What we're doing is we're using the incarnation to say, how does this influence or how does this event affect predestination? How does this event affect the free will of humanity? So in other words, you're not answering questions philosophically in the abstract. And this is a very, very difficult way of thinking for the modern Western mind because it's used to thinking in this way. So when you get to John of Damascus and what he has to say about angels and demons, what's very interesting is that he imbibes this whole ancient idea that spirituality in the sense of incorporeality is simply a less dense state of matter. In fact, it is almost verging on the what we would call the vacuum. But it is nonetheless, when you compare it to God, it is nonetheless a state of matter. So what he's doing is he's telling you right off the bat that plasma physicists, when they start talking about plasmas possibly being alive. Well, he's already told you that as far as he's concerned, as far as the tradition that he represents is concerned, it's certainly fine to think that way. So
So there's kind of a Gnosticism about academia,
yes,
right? And so really academia is really a secular version of Gnosticism in many
yes,
ways.
yeah, yeah. It's the inheritance. It's in the Western Academy, and I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but people don't believe me until they actually go out and do the work. Okay,
Yeah,
and until they do, I just sound like a broken record.
right. And
But
if the audience wants to understand a little bit more about what Joseph means when he says Gnosticism and its discontents, if you will, you really need to check out his book, God, History, and Dialectic, which,
that's where I was going.
yeah,
What I'm getting at here is the West's theology, the Western culture, whether you are atheistic or religious, has been profoundly influenced in the basic paradigms by which it thinks by the theology of St. Augustine of Hippo Regius, the single most important church father for Western culture. What Augustine did in his doctrine of God was he essentially made all the divine attributes absolutely identical to each other. A equals B, B equals C. And with that step, what he did was he basically subjected God to a process of nominalism and nihilism. Because
wow.
in effect, what he has just said is God's holiness is the same thing as his goodness, is the same thing as his predestination, and on it goes. So those terms that we use of God do not indicate any reality in God that is distinct from other realities in God. What he's done is he said they all reduce to one absolute same thing.
That sounds like Plotinus.
It is Plotinus. Yeah. There is a heavy Neoplatonic influence in St. Augustine. Absolutely. So that by the end of the process, what you get is this complete and total collapse. And by the way, if you can collapse those types of things in God, you can also do it in man and everything else.
And those that that sort of equilateral theology, if you will,
Yeah.
that's another form of obfuscation as well
Yes.
as being a cultic
Yes.
approach.
Yes. Yeah. And this is the basis, in my opinion, of why you have the Western Academy and the American Academy in particular pumping out all of this stuff, because what they're really doing, let's give another example of what I'm talking about, this presence, this persistence of a way of thinking in the popular culture. Let's look at the idea of reparations, that we owe X amount of money to black people for slavery or what have you. Well, what is that? That's the doctrine of penance and satisfaction in a
Right.
secular form.
Right.
So, why would we owe anything to a particular part of the population? Well, the other part of this equation is that you have the idea that there can be such a thing called sin nature, a collective guilt that you inherit from Adam and Eve by dint of your common human nature with them. Now, again, this is not the doctrine of the early church. It is not. It is the twisting of the doctrine by Augustine of Hippo. So again, you're in the presence of an all-consuming cultural matrix, whether you like it or not. And the only way to escape it is to go back and dig about what actually happened in Christian history, and do so with a mind open enough to understand that what you have been taught about it may be wrong,
Right.
because I can guarantee you it is wrong.
Yeah, with respect to reparations, I mean, it even fails at the scale of Aristotle's, exposition of compensatory justice.
Yes, absolutely. Of course it does. It
Yeah,
fails in almost every way you can think of.
right,
Ayn Rand has a wonderful critique of the doctrine in Atlas Shrugged. I mean, for
right,
crying out loud, it's not as if people haven't been thinking about this. But what happens is when you throw out that doctrine, in the Western way of thinking, you're throwing out the idea that you don't inherit anything from Adam and Eve. Well, you do inherit something from them, but what you inherit is not moral culpability.
wow,
What you inherit is physical and spiritual corruption. You inherit death. It's not in the day that ye eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, ye shall surely sin, and your descendants shall be guilty. It is that you shall surely die.
right.
You're putting alphabet soup into the gas tank and the car ain't going to run.
Yeah, and there seems to be a sort of a meta, sort of dialectic about this as well,
Yes,
in that the patristic tradition supported the initial decentralization of the churches,
absolutely.
whereas the Aristotelian model supported the centralization of the churches and the appointment of an elite.
Well, yes, what happens is there is an inversion within the Western religious mind that is, to me, the fruit of what Augustine does and how he formulates his doctrine of God. Because if you study theology in any Western school, be it Roman Catholic, Protestant, Anglican, what have you, the order of questions is always the same. Always. So, in other words, when you study the doctrine of God, let's say you're studying in a Roman Catholic seminary, the first thing you're going to learn about is the being and attributes of God. Okay. And you can see this order of theology, or as I call it, the Order of Theology, laid out very clearly in systematic theology after systematic theology in the West. Aquinas reproduces it. The Louis Sperry Chafer of Dallas Theological Seminary reproduces it. Everybody reproduces it. After you talk about the being and attributes of God, then you go on to talk about the persons of the Trinity. So, in other words, the unity of God is placed above the diversity in God, being, then attributes, then persons. And remember, the attributes are all equivalent to each other. They're all identical.
They cancel each other out.
They cancel each other out. Right. Now, compare and contrast that order of theology. One God, in other words, the unity of God, is located in the abstract impersonal essence. And at the end, you talk about the persons. Well, Christianity is all about the persons. So when you look at the creed that you say in liturgy on Sunday, I believe in one God, comma, the Father. So, in other words, right off the bat, you're locating the unity of the Godhead, not in an abstraction called the essence. You're locating the unity of the Godhead in the person of the Father. So, the order of doing theology is in the patristic mind the exact opposite of what it is that you learn in a Western seminary. You start
Wow.
with the persons, then you start talking about their common, here comes an interesting word, their common operations. Notice, not attributes,
Mm,
operations. In other words, things that the persons are doing.
yeah.
Okay. And then finally, you come to the conclusion about the essence that they all are. So, in other words, if to be blunt about it, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, chances are it's a duck, or at least a member of that part of the bird family that has bills and likes to swim in water. So, yeah, it is a completely different order. And we're way off the topic here, but here's the clincher. When you scramble the order in theology, you're also scrambling the answers. So, in other words, theology is a bit like dealing with Cantor numbers if you're a mathematician. When you deal with the transfinite numbers, addition and subtraction are not commutative in terms of their order. So if you perform certain functions in a certain order, you get different answers. It is exactly that way in theology. When you scramble the order of questions, you're going to get aberrant answers, and they're going to lead you down false paths, and in many cases cul-de-sacs, because you're not going to be able to resolve the question.
Fascinating. So in the patristic tradition,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, God it has no properties.
Right. In the absolute central core of the patristic tradition, the essence of God is absolutely unknowable and undefinable.
Wow.
And to give you an example of how seriously this is taken, in the 14th century there was a Greek archbishop by the name of Gregory Palamas. He is a saint in the Orthodox Church, and in fact, he's considered one of the three pillars of orthodoxy in the Orthodox Church. In other words, one of the figures who defines Eastern Orthodoxy and does so in a way that clearly distinguishes it from Latin Western scholasticism. Okay.
Right.
The other two being St. Photius the Great and St. Mark of Ephesus. Now, Gregory Palamas said something in one of his works called, I think it was the Triads, in one of his works that would make absolutely no sense to a medieval Western scholastic. And what Palamas said was, if God exists, the world does not. And if the world exists, God does not. Now, that sounds like the guy's on some sort of head trip, or he's tripping out on acid or something, and he's lost his mind. But what he's trying to tell you is you cannot, by any process of analogy, climb up from the existence of the world to the existence of God, because they are not univocal phenomena.
Right.
So, in other words, this is very difficult for a Westerner to wrap their mind around. You can only symbolize the infinities of God. You cannot ever exhaustively define them. And that means also that you can never come up with neat and tidy syllogisms about them. The 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas for proving the existence of God would make no sense in the Eastern Orthodox context. No sense whatsoever. And by the way, the same thing holds true for mankind and for the ultimate infinity, which is personhood. You can only symbolize it, you can never exhaustively define it. That's a huge one. Most people get terribly tripped up by that.
Well, it actually is roughly analogous to some aspects of the Buddhist tradition.
Yes,
Actually, they have no
yes.
problem with it at all.
No, I understand that, and the ways of thinking about these things are very similar, and in fact, some of the piety is.
And also the operations of the Buddhist saints,
Yes,
and the ones that are non-returners, they they have properties, they have behaviors, they
right,
have
right,
subjects they're interested in, jurisdictions, if you will.
right.
Uh, right.
Yeah, but they are never defined by their operations.
They are defined by their personhood.
Right. I would say they're symbolized by their personhood.
Oh, symbolized by the prayer. That's right. Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
Right.
So in the book, you talk about or relate John of Damascus,
Mm-hmm.
the properties of angels,
Mm-hmm.
um, and one of the ones that I thought was interesting, or the two that were, well, they're all interesting, but the one that really caught my eye was the ability to penetrate ordinary matter,
Yes.
and subsequently the ability to shapeshift.
Right.
Do you care to comment on that a little bit?
Well, this is why I think he's so crucial to the plasma life hypothesis, because on the on the view of most plasma physicists, plasmas can penetrate other types of matter, and they can, so to speak, exist inside of other matter. And again, a classic example of that would be a thunderstorm. Obviously, not all the clouds in a thunderstorm are plasma, but when you see lightning arcing and so on and so forth, that's plasma. And so there are regions within the thunderheads, within the clouds themselves, that are going to be electrical dipoles. In other words, you're going to have a high degree of ionization occurring within those clouds between positive and negative charges, each confined to particular regions. So they can exist. In other words, that plasma state can exist inside of the wider cloud phenomenon that comes along with a thunderstorm. So it's it's part of the angelic lore that these beings can penetrate through matter just like plasma. And when you get right down to it, the Damascene also points out that angels have a very kind of sparse materiality, and they can assume, therefore, they can, so to speak, will themselves into a form or a perception of a form that appears pleasing to us. They can look like humans and so on and so forth. So yeah, this too I think is part of the plasma life hypothesis. What I'm suggesting is that all of this lore that we have about angels and demons and so on might in fact be coming from the idea that plasmas are alive, and in some cases might be not only alive but intelligent.
Mm.
And if that's the case, some of these plasma structures are billions of years old. And if we're dealing with an intelligent creature that's billions of years old, it has a very long memory and therefore lots of information
And lots of entanglement events.
and lots of entanglement events. Yes, absolutely. So, it's a hypothesis that goes a long way in terms of its explanatory power, explaining why we do have all of this lore about angels within Judaism and Christianity, to a lesser extent in Islam with the jinn and so on. We have all of this lore about the seven sages, the rishis in the Vedic literature. You mentioned Buddhism. In Buddhism, you have the idea that you can materialize thought forms or intentions
Sure.
in things like tulpas and so on. So you've got all of this lore. What I'm getting at is you've got all of this lore that appears to be related to the way the plasma life hypothesis actually functions, and that
Right.
that hypothesis might actually be the basis or one of the explanatory basis of explaining all this lore that we have about these
Right.
kinds of beings. So yeah,
Acro-
it's a
Across
very
the cultures of the earth too.
across the cultures of the earth. Yeah, and when you boil all of those different pieces of lore down, they're telling you essentially the same thing,
Right.
that there's a kind of life form that is vis-a-vis our materiality, appears to be more or less incorporeal, and that is able to assume a physical existence at will, and that has the ability to leap tall buildings with a single bound, so to speak, because that essentially is what a plasma is. And let's go further. Since we're already off the end of the twig here. um,
Right.
the other interesting thing that is true in many ancient religions, particularly Egypt, is that stars are alive. Well, what are stars? They're plasma.
Right. I mean, the whole idea of the sun god
Right.
in Mesoamerica.
Yeah, the sun god,
Yeah.
the heretic Pharaoh in Egypt worshiping Ra as the sun, on we could go.
Right.
Well, why is that there? And Did they just kind of decide, oh, that's an interesting idea, let's do that this millennium? No, I don't think so. I
Yeah,
think I think there's a science behind all of this, and I think that uh, Temple, to his credit, when he writes his book and kind of assembles everything together, I think really what he's trying to tell us is that we're just on the cusp of recovering some of this. We're just starting.
right. In the middle of a materialist age.
Right.
But
Right.
we're running into the dead end sign on the materialist road,
Yep.
and we're saying, okay, why are the answers coming up nil?
Well, I think the answers are coming up nil because we still have yet to realize the deep philosophical implications of quantum mechanics, and we will never realize them adequately in this culture without trying to approach those implications from the tradition that founded this culture.
Well, the quantum physicists, kind of like tilted their hat at this tradition with the principle of complementarity.
Yes, they did. They did. That whole thing has been part of the tradition of this culture for a very long time. But I don't think that there has been any adequate progress to it because what they're afraid to address is the idea of personhood, of consciousness.
Right.
And what the West keeps doing, and I caution people here that this is an egregious, grievous error. But what the West keeps doing is equating soul and person. They are not the same thing. They are not. The soul approaches and approximates and can reveal the person, but they are not the same thing. Because every individual, if you stop and think about how this works out in law, every individual is always in their unique personhood, always more than the sum total of their mind, memory, will, and emotional life. Always.
That's fascinating. And all of these things tip back to the perceived threat of the elites
Yep.
to the actions of individuals.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. There's always a hard core that is not capturable.
Right. And that's true in the Buddhist tradition too. The,
Yes.
the, the idea of timeless awareness,
Yeah.
and the fact that what we call the soul, they would call essentially the inherent intrinsic timeless awareness that goes beyond the body.
Right.
Right.
I think probably if we're going to draw equivalences between Buddhist thinking and patristic thinking, I think probably what the patristic teaching means by hypostasis or personhood is closer to what you're getting at.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I just don't have the words. So what is the angelic uncertainty principle?
Ha! I gotta tell you, the passage of Saint John of Damascus. It's from a book of his called "On the Orthodox Faith," and it's from the very front part of that work. Um, I read this work, Kelly, when I was in college as a sophomore. And when I read that particular passage of what I'm calling the angelic uncertainty principle, I was just absolutely literally gobsmacked. Because if you change but a few terms and words, it's like reading a quirky patristic version of Heisenberg's quantum uncertainty principle.
Yeah,
It's just, and you've read it, you know how close it is.
it is close. Yeah, I
It
read
is,
both of them.
yeah, it's very close. So for the listeners who don't remember, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle basically is that you cannot measure the position and the momentum of an electron at the same time. These are in his mathematics what he calls conjugate attributes. Interesting that in his system you cannot equate the attributes. Okay. So so
Yeah.
anyway, the Damascus has a little statement that an angel cannot be in all places and energize at the same time. So in other words, again, he's talking about position and energizing. He's talking about momentum.
Right.
And
So, and
I
these
it,
and these quantum conjugates are operators.
and these quantum yes, these quantum conjugates are operators. They do things, okay?
Right.
They're not just attributes, they're doing stuff, okay?
Right.
And I read that, Kelly. I was just absolutely flabbergasted
Right.
that that someone writing in the 7th century would come so absolutely breathtakingly close to a statement of the same principle that is at the very foundation of quantum mechanics. I just you
What
really have to wrap your mind around how
we have
breathtaking
to
that is.
yeah, we have to feel sorry for our materialist friends because they keep bumping up against the same thing and they
Yeah,
keep trying to turn in the other direction, and what they find is another aspect of that thing.
yeah, that's right. They can't get away from it.
Right.
And it's reached the point, this materialist frustration with the physicists that have been talking about the anthropic cosmological principle
Yeah.
that if you change the physical constants just a few tiny decimal places, none of this stuff would exist, much less observers to observe it. So you get the idea that there's so many of these mathematically precise relationships that give rise to life and give rise to intelligent life, that these physicists are actually talking about. It looks as if the universe was intentionally designed to be observed not only from without but from within.
Right.
And so here's the Damascus scribbling away,
Yeah.
and basically he's telling you exactly the same thing. Well, we've got these creatures out there, and they can pretty much zap around all sorts of places, but they can't do that at the same time that they energize. In other words, they can't do that at the same time as they focus their willful intention.
Wow.
So you get into Damascus this idea that, okay, these things are what we would probably call hyperdimensional beings. They can exist in a multitude of different places at one and the same time, but they focus themselves where their willful intention is focused. So the analogy that I draw is, okay, imagine you're standing in the frame of a doorway and you have one foot planted in one room and another foot planted in another room. Which room are you in? Well, you're in both rooms. But imagine now that your head is turned toward one or another of those rooms. Where are you now? Well, you're still planted in both rooms, but your willful intention and focus is only in one of those rooms.
Right. You've increased the probability that you're going to be in one of those rooms in the future.
Right. Exactly.
So it's like
And
a probability argument in quantum mechanics.
exactly. Exactly. So we're back now with the idea of willful focus and intention becoming part of the physics. And again, this goes back to what really disturbed physicists when the uncertainty principle was first announced, because what it was telling you was your willful intention in performing an experiment to take a measurement determined the result of the experiment before you even performed it on the basis of what you were looking for. So if you want to measure the position of an electron, you are determining the outcome of the experiment is going to be some positional location rather than the momentum of the electron. And on we could go.
Right. It's the same order of operations.
It's the same order of operations, precisely. So
Establish the intention, take the measurement.
establish the
Establish the
intention,
intention,
take the measurement.
right.
Right. Right. Isn't that interesting? Angelology
Yeah.
and quantum mechanics.
Angelic mechanics.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you also mentioned in the book a relationship to entanglement. Now,
Hmm.
for those who are listening who don't know what entanglement is, there's a curious phenomenon that was discovered in the 20s in Germany that demonstrated that particles that are close to one another in a magnetic field uh, have very specific behaviors that result from becoming close in that magnetic field. They display oppositional properties. So if this particle goes up, that particle goes down, right?
Hmm.
In that magnetic field. So they go in different directions, and they do it uniformly
Hmm.
on a statistical basis over time,
Hmm.
right? And this experiment was called the Stern-Gerlach experiment.
Yep.
Uh, and of course Gerlach's a rather interesting fellow for a number of other reasons, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Does that one ring a bell, folks? But anyway,
And,
go ahead.
but this idea of entanglement has now grown, and it's sort of a little mini industry in
Hmm.
physics and astronomy or astrophysics, where we're starting to see entanglement treated as a network phenomenon, and it also as an information field.
Right.
Right. So how does that kind of stuff relate to what you were talking about in the book?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah.
Let's just go to Walter Gerlach for a minute. Gerlach, as I've pointed out in a number of my books, is the fellow who was at the ultimate scientific head of the Nazi Bell Project. And when you look at the Bell Project, what are they doing? They're spinning up, in my opinion, a compound of mercury thorium isomer 229 in a plasma focus. And then they're subjecting it to gobs of electrostatic shock. So here we have plasma, okay?
Yeah.
And Gerlach is involved. And the other thing we need to remember is that when plasmas were first subjected to magnetic fields by David Bohm, who came up with the really weird insight, hey, these things might be alive, is when they were subjected to these kinds of electromagnetic forces, what happened? They would show discrete regions of ionization, or as you just said, particles would do one thing here and do the exact opposite there. So, in
Yeah,
other words,
like you see the hieroglyphics of the
right,
ancient tribes,
right,
right, describing like you did in the Cosmic War, these plasma effects
right,
where they're almost attacking or defending as well.
right. You see all sorts of plasma effects.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the question of entanglement. If you pursue the idea of entanglement, you ultimately come away with the idea of non locality as well.
Yeah.
And, again, John Stuart Bell formulated this in what was it? I think the early
19,
60s,
1960.
19, yeah, or very early 60s then.
Yeah.
And you come away with the idea that what happens in entanglement is not at all affected by the distance between the particles thus entangled. So we have Einstein's horror of horrors, spooky action at a distance. Now, what I find interesting about all of this is when you look at plasmas, and particularly at some plasma structures in the universe, some of them are just simply gigantic. And remember, folks, we're dealing now with a form of very, very fine, nearly vacuum state matter. So almost completely immaterial, but nevertheless very thin material. There is a plasma structure in the universe that's called the Great Sloan Wall. It is approximately 100, what was it, 167.37, I don't remember the exact figure, billion light years long. Now, folks, I did a little back of the envelope calculation of how long that would be just in terms of miles. And it's something like 1 septillion. It's just this ginormous figure, to quote Art Bell. And what this means is, if you stop and think about how does a structure like that even hold together if the theory of general relativity is true?
Yeah.
And the answer is it doesn't. So something else is holding all of that information in that structure together. And the only thing that you can come up with that would suggest this is some sort of entanglement and non-locality that is also a fundamental property of the medium itself. In other words, what we're talking about now is that there's a relationship between plasma and the 19th century idea of ether luminiferous, and that ether in turn could be compressible. In other words, it was subject to all the typical constraints of waves of rarefaction and compression within it, and that would certainly fit a kind of non-material plasma.
And also the operators on those things,
Exactly.
like hydrodynamical in some
Right.
respects,
Exactly. Exactly.
gaseous in some respects.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. It's gonna manifest all these things, and this might explain yet another bit of odd lore. If you look at these massive plasma structures and you compare them to neurons and synapses in a brain, they're almost identical. And
Yeah.
what's very interesting with both of these phenomena is that in turn these things are aperiodic crystals. So in other words, they are well designed and well suited to do what? Store information.
Hmm.
So when you're dealing with plasma structures that immense, you're approaching the old occult lore doctrine of akashic records.
Yep.
So in other words, again, folks, what I'm getting at here in this book is that the plasma life hypothesis, which may or may not be true, I want to stress this, we are at the beginning of entertaining a hypothesis. But just extrapolating from the hypothesis, its explanatory power, particularly in terms of a lot of these doctrines in the occult and esoteric lore and religious texts and so on, is huge. It's gigantic.
So telescopes, are powerful based on the size of the dish or the
Right,
array of dishes, right?
right,
And so these plasmas, I mean, being that big, I mean, if you think about them as a telescope dish,
right.
you know, you have an extremely large,
Yeah,
ginormous, you have to put it in our bell terms, capacity to detect new information.
right, right, right. They could very easily function. You've got the very large phased array telescope array out in, I think, New Mexico, Arizona, one of the two. And what is that? It's about a mile and a half across. And you're talking about the possibility of a detector, a phased array that is quite literally much, much larger by several orders of magnitude than the entire galaxy.
Right.
It's just, and that boggles the mind
It
when you,
does boggle the mind.
you and I are just fly specks compared to these things.
Right. So we have like the ether having operative properties
Right,
such as hydrodynamics and
right.
and the mechanics of gas and things like that. Is intelligence an operator in this scenario?
Well, it has to be if you
Right.
are. It has to be if you are considering that willful intention enters any observation or measurement.
Right.
So it must be, in terms of the pure theory of it. How all this works out, I don't know. I suspect strongly that, I've said for many years, Kelly, that mathematical physics, when it comes to time, is one dimensional,
Yeah.
because a delta t function, which is what they use to explain differences in system states, is nowhere near as subtle in its way of describing the relationships of objects and events in time.
Well, what they call
Uh,
time is really acoustic meter.
yes, what I was getting at, though, is that those things are nowhere near the nuanced complexity of natural human languages.
Yeah.
And if you stop and think about it, try and put, let's say, an English pluperfect sentence into mathematical notation.
It would be pretty long.
It would be pretty long. Yeah, exactly. But we do this all the time and effortlessly.
Right.
So I suspect that the other thing that we're going to eventually get around to is we're going to have a form of mathematics that is grammatical and linguistic in a way that current mathematics is only just beginning to approach. The old rule is you have a proper equation if you can look at the equation and translate it into a grammatical sentence of English or whatever natural language that you have. And that's true. But what that seems to be indicating is that mathematics is kind of a subset of the grammar of languages.
Hmm.
So we need a much more nuanced approach to how we describe systems and the objects in it than contemporary mathematical physics, with, as you put it, its acoustic meter, is capable of doing. And I'm totally agreed with that. And I think eventually that's the other thing that's going to come out of this.
Now, Leibniz tried to get at the same thing
Oh yes, absolutely he did.
with
Yeah.
his analysis C2 as well
Yes.
as the Characteristica Universalis.
Yes, absolutely he did. I'm convinced that Leibniz was absolutely keen to this precise problem,
Yeah.
and that analysis C2 is just his fancy way, I think, of thinking in terms of topology.
Right.
And Characteristica Universalis, he said such strange things about that we need to come up with a symbolic calculus that gives us the approximation of calculation without numbers.
Right.
So what he's trying to do is wrestle with pure concepts. And again, the closest thing we have to that type of entity in modern mathematics, I think, is are the Cantor transfinite numbers. But even then, we're not all the way there. What Leibniz wants is quite literally a calculus for metaphysics. That's what he
Correct.
wants.
Yeah, that he made that quite clear.
Yeah.
It was its ability to the operations of thought
Yes.
themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And since language is so much a part of thought, you cannot have operators that are not linguistic in nature.
Yeah, not to get too off track, but at that time there seems to have been an arms race among the various noble families in Europe
Hmm.
to get to it first. I mean, you had Descartes, you had
Yes.
Newton,
Yes.
you had Leibniz, you had
Yes.
any number of other people that were all trying to uncover this thing, and it was like an arms race.
Well, it's interesting that you mention that, because I talk about Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton in a little book of mine uh, called Talk Radio for the Eyes. Uh, my friend and I, Scott DeHart and I, put that book out as kind of a response to questions that we were getting about another book of ours about transhumanism. But I point out in that book that Descartes, Newton, and Leibniz all were fascinated by a particular idea, and that idea was that the ancients had some method of mathematical analysis that had either been lost or deliberately hidden. And what's very interesting is that Descartes kind of sets off this whole idea. He's the first person to make the observation. And then Newton picks up on it and says, well, they might have disguised this by a certain clever slyness. But if we were to describe this method of analysis in ordinary language, it would take so long that, we'd never get anywhere. So he's suggesting by that observation that it was a kind of symbolic calculus. It was a calculus that you could calculate with by the manipulation of symbols according to certain algorithms. But the one that really outdoes both of them is Leibniz. Because Leibniz not only says that the ancients had such a method, but that he thinks that he has found and uncovered some basic particles or parts of it. And I think that he most certainly did. And his analysis C2 being, I think, the first significant blow. He's literally describing a kind of topology of metaphysics. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They have been on the quest to discover this, whatever it was. My regular readers know I have this thing in my books called the topological metaphor of the medium. Well, I've been thinking for years and years and years along similar lines that there has to be some sort of mathematical formalism to be able to deal with all of this that we do not yet have.
Fascinating. So the the essence of what these guys were trying to find was a way of metaphorical or topological analysis that allowed the various aspects of thought to be, in other words, to clear out all the limitations on that, all the hindrances to symbolically processing thought.
Yes, I think in a nutshell, my personal view is that what they were attempting to do was to come up with a calculus of analogies
Wow.
and something that would enable someone, let's play Noam Chomsky here for a minute. And again, I think Noam Chomsky is another key figure in this quest to symbolize thinking, because he does this all the time in his transformational generative grammar. And if you look at what he does, he even borrows heavily from topological symbols, the mapping function, and so on, enter his linguistic notation. So what do I mean by a calculus of analogies? If you, and you're going to have to kind of follow me here, if you look at what an analogy does or is, the first thing you'll notice is that everybody listening to this program right now has some sort of innate analogical competence, to borrow Chomsky's phrase about innate grammatical competence. And that innate analogical competence is what suggests to us when we react to someone else's analogy by saying, oh, good analogy, or, oh, that analogy doesn't hold. So, in other words, all of us have a sense of what constitutes an apt or inept analogy. So, what does an analogy do? Well, an analogy enables you to think across disciplinary contexts. So in other words, a peculiar form or idea or rule or shape or what have you can be found in one context and then you discover it in another. That's an analogy, very simply put. But now what happens in every process of analogy? What analogies do is they map one thing from one context to another. So, in other words, an analogy, topologically speaking, is always a common surface between two discrete contexts. The other thing that usually happens, and I'm willing to say until proven otherwise, probably always does, is you have the perception, and please understand here, we're dealing with perceptions. You have the perception that you lose a certain increment in the mapping from one context to another. So, in other words, that increment would be mathematically represented by a differential. So, in the process of mapping, you lose something from the original context, but you also gain an increment of information from the context you're mapping to. Because what analogies do is they always create the perception mentally that you've gained an insight. So, in the mapping of an analogy, what happens? You're losing an increment from the first context and gaining an increment from the second. And the example of this that I like to use for people is translation. Anybody who's translated a text from one language to another knows that you're going to lose a certain little increment of meaning. Translators struggle to preserve as much of the original meaning and information as possible, but you're going to lose a little bit. But you're also going to gain some insight or increment of information from the language you're translating into. And this is what most people don't get. So that's how analogies work. Once you set up the mapping function to show these incremental losses and gains and the common surface between the two, okay, once you set up that mapping function or operator, then something very interesting happens, because you'll discover that that very same equation can also describe inductive thought. In other words, from specific to general contextless principles. And it can also show deductive thought from no context to a specific instantiation of it. So notice what I'm suggesting. Inductive, deductive, and analogical thought all have the same shape. What differs between the three is the location of the generalized context.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. That's a wow.
Yeah.
And this is what I think the those three, and particularly Leibniz, were getting at. And I've read a lot about Leibniz's analysis C2. There's a whole book out on the subject. And just from reading the book, I can almost guarantee you this is exactly what he was thinking.
Right. So this very type of analysis that we're talking about is central to the thesis in the Demon in the Ekur book,
Yes, it is.
because you've got all these qualities of all
Yes.
these intelligent plasmas, these divine beings,
Yes.
and their properties
Yes.
translating into our realm in very specific operations.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. So which gets us to the shift that you have from part A to part B, where you move into.
Well, let me interrupt here before you get to that. Hold your
Okay.
thought. Hold your thought, because what I'm suggesting here and trying to get people to understand, I write a lot in my books about what I call the topological metaphor of the medium. And in fact, it's so important to my books that it first appears in the third pyramid book, Giza Death Star Destroyed. So, in other words, I wrote about all this very early on. And if you're paying close attention to what I'm doing in my books, you'll discover over and over and over that I'm using this common surface analogical rule to connect my books together. And sometimes you can do this. Think of analogies as sets with elements in those sets. If you have, let's say, n number of elements that are common to two different sets, then chances are your analogy is going to be very apt. In other words, the more elements, the more specific elements that you can connect from one context to another, the stronger the chances are that what you have found is true and that the analogy is apt. In some cases, you can only find one or two connections, and that doesn't necessarily mean the analogy is inept. It just means that it's less strong. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting is that there is a cardinality or a scalarity, if you want to use the mathematical terms, to the way analogies function. Now, what's interesting about the plasma life hypothesis is what I'm suggesting in this context of analogical thinking is that its explanatory power is almost off the charts.
Yeah.
The common elements between all of these different sets are huge. That's the key.
Yeah, and the fact pattern, forms up, and when I was doing experimental physics in college, we would do these measurements, or variety of different measurements over a period of time, when the histograms came out in patterns that
Yes.
were consistent,
Yes.
we knew that we had, like, you could see all the dots showing up in the same region of the paper.
Right.
You could
Right.
see that you were close to what you were trying to do.
Right.
And
Right.
if they're all over the place, or on the converse, like if you're expecting there to be a three-dimensional result, and all you get is a flat line, then you're stuck in the dialectic that our culture's been stuck in
Yes.
for
Exactly.
1,500 years.
Exactly. Yeah. Either or binary thinking is just not a very good system of thinking.
Yeah, and if you're not sure what binary thinking is, just spend a little while on social media.
Yeah. True. True enough. True enough. Yeah. The interesting thing about analogical thinking is that particularly the way I've attempted to lay it out, if those listening have a mathematical background and can kind of picture in their minds what I tried to describe, the interesting thing about it is that it's not binary at all, other than in the sense that, like every system of equations, it's got two sides in the middle. Um, Other than that, there's nothing binary about it. And
Hmm.
even that middle is interesting because the the original primary scission, to use Schwaller de Lubitsch's terms, is always a three, never a two. Ever,
Right.
ever, ever, ever. It's always a three. I'm thinking of a very famous quotation of one of the Cappadocian church fathers by the name of St. Gregory the Divine, who said, "There is no middle step of two."
Yeah.
When he's trying to lay out the doctrine of the Christian Trinity, he just comes right out and says that there's no middle step of two.
Wow.
And people, once you get into the habit of thinking this way, you'll be amazed at how many observations and insights open up to you.
Right. When I adopted the topological metaphor, when it got into my head, and I finally could see it, uh, all of a sudden I realized I started to become smarter over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it literally rewire. You're not the only one to have that reaction to it. I showed, I've got this big notebook where I've kept all these notes, most of them from years and years ago. I haven't worked on it in recent years at all, but I've got this notebook where I've jotted down my thoughts about this whole idea ever since the 1980s. And I let few people see it, but I have two friends. I've got to share this anecdote just to kind of buttress your experience with it, because I have two friends. One is a mathematician that used to work for Hewlett Packard and who published 6 papers in some obscure journal of cybernetics and cryptology. I don't even remember what it was, but he was not a mathematical slouch. And I had another friend who is an electrical engineer that did work on some classified projects for a major defense firm. And I shared my notes about this analogical calculus with both of them. And my mathematical friend literally sat in an armchair in my old house across from me years and years ago, reading this paper, these notes. And he kept saying, "Oh, mommy, this makes my head hurt. Oh, mommy, make him stop." And he finally handed the paper back to me, and he said, "You're either completely nuts or you're on to something hugely profound, and there's no middle ground here." so,
Wow.
so, and obviously, I think that no, this is not nuts. My other friend, just the electrical engineer, called me up one night, and all he said was, "Dude." I mean, I literally picked up the phone, and he didn't say hello or anything. He just said, "Dude, this stuff is rewiring my mind." And
Yeah, and it leads me to wonder if dialectic has of course it is. I mean, has been a tremendous instrument of control.
oh, absolutely. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, look at the way the fall of man is described in the book of Genesis. In the day that you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, ye shall surely die. Well, in commenting on that passage, Saint Maximus the Confessor, one of my favorite church fathers, in fact, I did my doctorate on the man. Um, he said that the fall was a fall into dialectic. So stop and think about that. This whole way of binary thinking
yeah,
is the fall.
and you can see that in the way that language is developed from
Yes.
the ancient period to the
Yeah.
modern period. You see that fall happening.
Yeah. Oh, there's a fascinating author that one of the members of my website put me onto by the name of Pierre Sabak. And what he does is precisely these types of linguistic uh, explorations, and he's come pretty much to that conclusion. It's a little bit more subtle and nuanced, but that's basically the conclusion that he's come to: is that this whole dialectic, this whole basically Gnostic dualistic way of thinking is how they've captured people. And
Right.
this is why I keep warning people. People think I'm nuts when I say, quit using this gender inclusive language. They have captured you if you surrender to them. Because what you're doing without realizing it is you're surrendering to a dualistic binary cosmology. That's what they want you to think,
And denaturing your thoughts.
and denaturing your thoughts. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're getting you into a virtual world that is at variance with the real world, and it's a world that they can manipulate linguistically. We're all the way back to Augustine again,
Again.
and the idea that all the divine attributes are nothing but parts in a big equals sign equation. That's all it
Right.
is.
Well, Sitchin certainly set a lot of people ablaze
Oh yeah, he sure did.
with his translations. Now, where was his office located?
Ha! Oh my. Zechariah, God bless him. Z- I Zechariah Sitchin is one of these frustrating characters because his macro scenario to me never made any sense. And basically, that scenario is we've got Nibiru out there that comes careening into the solar system every 3,600 years, wreaking havoc. And while they're doing that, they send out expeditions to scour the solar system for gold, and then the planet disappears for another 3,600 years. And it comes careening in almost perpendicular to the plane of the ecliptic. And I'm thinking, this makes no sense.
Yeah.
If that were happening, the planets would be bobbing like fishing bobbers on a pond, and
Right.
they're not
Well,
doing that.
a physician can be properly accused of practicing science without a license.
Yeah, well, exactly. But the problem with Sitchin is when you read his little scenarios, not the big macro scenario that's the context for his other observations, but when you read his other observations, that's where he really shines. That's where you find the brilliance of the man.
Yeah, well, the
Um,
guy could read cuneiform tablets, like they were the
right,
epic times.
right. He could do this, and he did so in such a way that he was not reading the cuneogram texts apart from the cylinder seals of Sumeria. And this is where it gets interesting. We're getting back to your question, I assure you. Because he will read, and in the Demon and the Ekur, I point out that he reads a text called the Ludlil Bel Nemeki, which is where the occurrence of the demon in the Ekur appears. Now, what's an Ekur? Ekur is the Akkadian word for a mountain, but it's also the same word that they use for a ziggurat or a pyramid. So, in other words, this word means both mountain and pyramid. And then in this text, he points out that there is a demon associated with an acre that is in the land that is over the horizon, namely Egypt. But his brilliance is that he interprets the text as referring to Egypt because in Sumerian descriptions at that time, pyramids are depicted as smooth sided. In other words, they're not the stepped pyramids that you find in Mesopotamia. They're the smooth sided pyramids that you find in Egypt. Now, that, like it or not, folks, is a stroke of genius. And what he's just said, once you follow his argument in detail, is that what he's saying is that there is a demon that was associated with the two great pyramids at Giza. That's what he said. Now, add the plasma life hypothesis to that. And what he might be saying is that there's an intelligent plasma that was associated with this complex. And that in his thinking, this complex was also involved in the pyramid wars, where the pyramid is used as a weapon. This is all Sitchin's hypothesis. And I read all of this years ago, Kelly, and I thought, okay, what Sitchin has just said is that this structure is a weapon. And he said this on the basis of some pretty interesting argumentation from Sumerian texts.
Right. There's definitely textual support.
Right. And on top of this, he's used the same text to argue that there are things missing from the structure. And he goes even further and says, well, that they were crystals of some sort. So, at the time I read all,
Again, with textual support.
yeah, again with textual support. And at the time I thought, okay, why has no one attempted to look at the Great Pyramid from the standpoint of an implied physics of a weapon in the structure? Why is no one looking at the wider textual context surrounding these structures?
Oh, the preservation of advantage through compartmentalization.
Right. Well, yes. Yeah. But once you say that, then you have to look at Sitchin himself. And what I find very interesting is the man's degree was in economics from the London School of Economics.
Wow.
So, this is hardly the kind of guy that you find cribbing notes in dusty old books from photographs of cuneogram clay tablets.
Wow.
And then how does he make his living? Well, he's an antiquities dealer, an antique dealer in New York City. And I'm thinking, what better sort of cover could someone like this have? Because this gives him the ability to claim that he's on business when he's going off to Egypt or Iraq or Mesoamerica and digging all this stuff up. But guess where his
And who's going to give a second glance to an economist?
exactly?
You know,
But guess where his office is?
where's that?
Rockefeller Center.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
Wow.
yeah, that's a wow.
That's a wow.
That's a wow. That, in other words, there is something about this man, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on him or on his sincerity or on his
No,
scholarship
it could
in
very
any way.
well that they wanted to keep him close.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Keep him under careful, close watch. Yeah. So who knows what's going
Yeah.
on here? But
I can
he,
imagine David Rockefeller really appreciating Zachariah Sitchin.
oh, I can too. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I can tell you things about Mr. Rockefeller off the record that I'm sure that you've already guessed because you've had your own little personal encounters.
Yeah. Yeah, sort of. Yeah, he was quite a character.
Yes, he certainly was.
Yeah. So Sitchin in the book, his translations were poo-pooed by a lot of academics, and
Yes,
so in your books you chose to use the academic translations,
yes,
and then you realized, well, look, there's only just a couple of differences.
yeah. This is the other thing that there were scholars out there um, that took pot shots at Sitchin for his, and incidentally at me for my at me for calling that ancient science a kind of paleophysics.
Oh, right.
I can think of
Yeah,
one.
anybody who questions their metrology is
Right.
immediately
Well,
attacked.
it wasn't me questioning the metrology. It was me questioning the whole biblical critical scholarship enterprise.
Yeah,
Um,
the Bible industrial complex.
yes, the Bible industrial complex.
Yeah.
But in Sitchin's case, they're the same group of people, and in some cases the same individual, were questioning his translation. So I know the translation game because I've translated texts, I
Yeah.
have published translated texts, and so on. So I know the old saw is, well, if you want to really zap an academic, just question their translations, and
Right, but translations are quite highly fallible because of the way that Western languages, modern languages are done. Right.
well,
I
it's
mean,
it's it's not so much that, it's just that most modern translations are translating a different philosophy with a different philosophy. I don't want to get into that because we're getting off the subject. What I want to get to
all right.
is the text that I use. Sitchin says, okay, I'm citing the Ludlow Bell Nemeki. Okay, so I go out and I look for that text, and I usually look for a text like that has been translated by some academic somewhere, and I cite that academic translated text. Or in this case, I found two different academic translations of the same text, and they both show obvious differences in the way they translate the text. But the key point is, at the passage that Sitchin is citing, They both contain the same concepts, and it's that's the key.
Right.
And this is where I just go ballistic with all these academic pettifoggers,
Yeah.
because what they're missing once again is they're hiding behind all this etymology and all these footnotes and all of this grammatical apparatus in their translations. They're hiding the fact that it's the same concepts at work.
Look, the reason why I didn't become an academic is because at the end of my college career, I realized that academics are the most repressed group of people there is.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it nowhere shows up better than in translation. So
Right.
just to get back to the problem of translation, and I hope everybody hears me now.
Yeah.
um, Bible translation is the absolute, as you put it, the Bible industrial complex, because the modern philosophy of translation is the philosophy called metaphrase. It is that philosophy recognizes that when they're dealing with the biblical text, particularly with the Greek of the New Testament, that they are dealing with a kind of language that is extraordinarily subtle and nuanced, and that in some cases a passage might mean as many as three or more different things depending on how you translate it. So a metaphrase translation is a translation that translates the simplest and most obvious meanings and ignores the rest.
Hmm.
This is the kind of translation, almost without any exception, that you find being pushed in modern translations of the Bible. A more classical approach to translation would be the King James, because the translators then are not trying to translate the simplest or least, or pardon me, the simplest or most obvious meaning of a passage. What they are trying to do is to translate into English, or even create a kind of English that is able to translate as many of the potential meanings of the passage as possible. And this is why the King James is so often difficult for people to understand. The reason why is that the underlying Greek is. Follow me?
Yeah.
Now, let me give you a classic example. I'm doing a book right now, researching a book right now, where I might be doing an update on the bearer bonds scandal.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
Yeah. So I'm researching a book that is taking me deep. You talk about a hall of mirrors and a Byzantine world, is taking me deeply into Vatican finances. Okay.
Yeah, ignore the man behind the curtain.
Yeah. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Ignore the man in the purple cassock.
Yeah.
It's just, it's that sort of thing. But in researching this, I'm reading a book where at the beginning of every chapter, this particular author has a little passage of scripture as the epigraph. So last night I'm bopping along and I'm reading, and I come to a chapter that has a passage from Galatians chapter 6, verses 6 and 7 and 8 as the epigraph. And it's talking about you reap what you sow. If you remember the context of this particular passage, you reap what you sow. And if you sow to your sinful nature, you will reap what you sow. And
Wow.
I'm thinking, no, it does not say sinful nature.
Wow.
What it says in the Greek, the word there that's being translated sinful nature, and this is by a Roman Catholic, by the way. The word translated sinful nature there is sarx, the Greek word sarx, like sarcoma comes from this. In other words, it's the Greek word for flesh. So
Oh,
again, in the guise of translation, they have attempted to translate a potential meaning of the passage, but they've done so by actually reading into the passage a whole theological development that is not actually there.
of course not.
So,
Yeah, it's like narrative programming.
exactly, exactly. So, folks, I'm going to say it again. You can take your new revised standard perversion, your American standard version, your new international version, your new Jerusalem version, your new American Bibles, and so on. Take all of those things and toss them in the bin.
There's nothing new under the moon.
There's nothing new under the moon or sun. Go get yourself a King James. It
Yeah.
will be difficult to read, and the reason why is that the underlying Greek is difficult. And there's no other way to understand it. And by the way, in certain key verses, that is the only version in the English language that gets all potential meanings of the verse correct. And I'm thinking principally here of Romans 5:12.
Right, I
It's
read that's an interesting selection. I read a book about the development of that Bible, and they invented whole elements of that had never existed before in
yes,
English language
yes,
in order to be able to faithfully translate the Greek.
yes, yes. That is exactly so. They literally created a kind of English that nobody ever spoke. Ever. And by the way, it's the same thing with Luther's Bible. He literally creates the modern German language by cobbling together the grammatical rules of different German dialects so that he can translate the New Testament. So the German Lutheran New Testament does for modern High German exactly what the King James did for English. And by the way, if you don't believe me, go read the preface to the King James. That's how people really talked back then. And
Right.
then compare the preface to the actual text of the Bible, and you're in a whole different world. It's just,
Yeah, the King James at that time it was early modern English.
well, it still is.
Yeah.
That's why you can still understand it.
Right.
And the other thing, the other advantage of that kind of English is that the second the second person singular and plural pronouns are different. Thou
Yeah.
and thee is singular and you is plural.
Right.
Which
So, speaking of words, odd words, I want to be able to get to this before we go.
uh-huh.
There's an amazing part of your book where you talk about the tetragram. Um, you know what I'm talking about?
Well, give me more detail here as to
Yeah,
what you're
there's a
saying.
there's an inscription on the temple, le tetragram,
Oh,
VOEO.
the tetragrammaton.
Yeah,
Okay, yes.
I'm using
It's
the French pronunciation.
it is not an inscription on the temple. It's an inscription on the actual door into the Great Pyramid.
Oh, I meant the pyramid. Yeah, I
Yeah,
misspoke.
yeah.
Yeah.
The
It looks like a corporate logo.
there is yeah there are four characters. This is the only stone inscription on all of the Great Pyramid that is probably from the actual builder, whoever built it. It's four symbols. No one knows what they mean because they do not resemble any Egyptian hieroglyphical character, with one possible exception, which is a kind of a character of four vertical lines in a circle. Now, the hieroglyph that comes the closest to that character in Egyptian hieroglyphs is three horizontal, not vertical, three horizontal lines in a circle, which is one of the ways of writing the syllable ku in Khufu.
Oh, wow.
Okay, but again, I'm not aware that there is any hieroglyphical tradition of that syllable being represented by vertical lines in a circle.
Yeah, let me
Yeah.
try to paint a picture for the listeners. So there's four characters. They're just like a typical word. If you spelled it out in English, it would be vo-a-o, but
Uh-huh.
with complexity. So the V looks like one of those Star Trek emblems that Kirk wore.
Right.
That's kind of a thick V. It's thicker at the bottom than it is at the top. It looks kind of pyramidal to a degree. And then there's an O that looks like a racetrack.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a sort of an E with no vertical bar.
Right.
So there's three lines that are horizontal. So it's V, O, and then this E with no vertical bar. And then there's this sort of weird, like Joseph described it. It's a circle it's an open circle, meaning that inside the circle, there are three, it looks like a plasma to me, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And but it looks like there's a central bar that looks like a fluorescent bulb, one of those office ones that's goes,
Mm-hmm.
across the ceiling, and then there's these two almost like circular triangles,
Mm-hmm.
like hemispheres on the side of it. So these four characters are together, and they're on the pyramid, and nobody knows what they mean.
Right. They are the pyramid has an actual door which is on the north face of the pyramid. The door is beneath two gigantic corbels, granite corbels. Um, and I put all of this along with the picture so that you can see this. You can go online and look at the difference between the ninth century blast and chisel through that the Caliph Al Maimun did, and then the actual real door of the Great Pyramid, which was discovered much, much later. Um, these marks that Kelly is describing appear on a little raised relief platform right above a small little hollow entryway to the Great Pyramid. Um, the French author that you're referring to also believes that the bas relief that these things are chiseled on look very much like the hieroglyph of Khufu, son of the horizon. And in that case, yes, I would agree. But again, nobody really knows what these four symbols represent or what they're intended to signify. My suspicion is that they represent or signify either the function of the structure or they signify some sort of instruction that you're supposed to follow once you get into the structure
I
itself.
mean, it leaves a lot to the imagination. What
Yes.
I humorously, my first self translation was, "Please check in with the receptionist."
Yeah. Yeah. Don't. Yeah. Identification required to enter.
Yeah, authorized
Or
personnel only.
authorized personnel only. Deadly force authorized.
Right.
That's
Something.
something like that.
Yeah.
The only other inscription on that part of the structure is an inscription that was left there on that doorway in the upper right by the 19th century Prussian expedition to Giza. And the inscription, it was led by a German archaeologist by the name of Lepsius. And he actually had an inscription chiseled onto the structure in Egyptian hieroglyphics, you know, which is interesting because at least the Prussians did it right, and the inscription basically attributes to King Frederick Wilhelm IV divine status as a son of Ra.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, okay, why did the Prussians go to all this trouble to make sure that got that piece of graffiti got chiseled onto the Great Pyramid?
It
And
it it, it looks nothing like graffiti to me.
no, it's not. It's not. But the real problem here is, of course, that the Prussians were familiar enough with Egyptian hieroglyphics to do a good job of it. And later, just a few years later, along comes the British Colonel Howard Vyse, who made that supposed discovery of the painted cartouche of Khufu in the so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber, which I think, and I think Scott, what's his name, the British guy has conclusively proven, finally once for all, were indeed hoaxes and forgeries. So the only thing that ever really the Egyptologists used to attribute the Great Pyramid to the time and to the person of Khufu was a forgery.
Wow.
No, no one knows, and quite frankly, I think the structure is just older than dynastic Egypt by several thousands of
What's
years.
interesting about the tetragram, to use the French pronunciation, is is how much more modern it looks than anything hieroglyphic.
Oh yes, yeah,
That's the other odd thing.
yeah. It looks very modern, and like I've said many times, to me it looks like mathematical symbols rather than
Oh yeah.
spelling out anything.
It also has sort of a pictographic quality to it. Like
Yes,
the first symbol could be something about the energy production.
yeah,
The other thing could be the development of the plasmas, and then the E character, the sort of E character, could be the stepping up or amplification of whatever it produced, and then that last one being the resonance.
yeah, yeah. We simply don't know.
Yeah,
No one has any idea what those things are,
it's a
but
fascinating.
it really is. It really is.
Wow. And how does that relate to the overall plasma life hypothesis? Is it just thrown in there because it needs to be there, but doesn't really relate to the overall hypothesis?
Well, I threw it in there because I've mentioned the that inscription before on
Yeah,
many interviews, and I never found the book until I tracked it down prior to writing this one. But
yeah.
yes, I threw it in there because the whole idea of a tetragrammaton, well, you know, the term tetragrammaton is usually used for the name Yahweh.
Oh my gosh.
In that's a tetragrammaton.
That and Yahweh also has four letters.
Yahweh also has four letters. Yeah.
Wow.
So, it's another suggestive,
Wow.
contextually suggestive bit of information that suggests that the structure was connected very explicitly and deliberately to beings of extraordinary power. And, the Yahweh of the Old Testament, depending on which part of the Old Testament you're reading, is either a really nice, cool dude or
Yeah.
somewhat less than that.
Yeah, a man with very strange barbecue tastes.
Yes, a man with very strange barbecue taste.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, you got the idea that somehow the structure was connected to one of these very powerful entities. So
Yeah.
to me, I put it in there because it's suggestive of the whole demon and the Ekur concept.
Yeah, yeah, and also the sort of the temporal issue of like, when did this thing get built, and
Yes.
and the whole, Egyptology claim, and then you see this completely different language,
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
like, uh-oh, another data point on our histogram of why the Jonkles and Daisies crowd needs to, find another tree to bark up.
Yeah. Now that the other thing I should mention there is I tried and over the years have tried and tried and tried to find any Egyptological explanation of that particular inscription,
Yeah.
and I have not found any.
That's
Now
because none
I
exist.
well, that may be or it may not be. I don't know. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But if it does exist, they certainly buried it well.
Yeah.
you know, I I
Right.
I simply have not found anybody willing to explain to me what that supposedly is.
Yeah. So in our previous dialogues, we talked about how this pyramid is a resonator
Hmm.
with like uh like geometric levels of complexity,
Yes.
and just basically, amplified the Earth's energy along with whatever was fed into it. Sort of, as Chris Dunn suggested, it was a hydrogen plasma.
Hmm.
And then there's these sort of these musical notes. I mean, Chris Dunn says in his recent interview that the key of the pyramid itself is F sharp minor, and that the Grand Gallery is in A,
Uh-huh. Oh, I'm
which
not surprised.
is that a one? Isn't that a 1 3 or
F sharp to A would be a minor third.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and the F sharp minor is, of course, that's the key of terror, right?
well, F sharp, the note F sharp is exactly a tritone
No, I meant
from,
the key of, like in the in musical theory, F sharp minor is used to indicate certain things, right?
well, in the key itself,
Yeah.
yes. Uh, I was trying to get to that by a different
Oh, okay,
route.
sorry.
F sharp is exactly a tritone. If the fundamental is C,
Right.
F sharp is the tritone. It is exactly halfway between low and high C. The interval is
Yeah,
exactly the
that's
same.
fascinating.
Now,
I didn't
that
realize that. Yeah.
that that tritone is the diabolus in musici. It's the devil in music.
Right.
Guess, by the way, who came up with that designation for it?
No idea.
Saint Augustine of Hippo.
Oh, wow.
Now, that specific interval is to him the diabolus in musici because the interval itself is dissonant.
Right.
However, that interval also forms the key functionality or operator in any dominant seventh chord.
Yeah, that's right.
So, make of that what you will. Um, I do think that, I tried to lay this out in my Giza Death Star Revisited. That if you look at the harmonic relationships of the dimensionality of the structure, over and over and over again, you see nested feedback loops,
Yeah.
constant.
Right.
And it's particularly the case when you examine the Grand Gallery, the Antechamber, the King's Chamber, and so on and so forth. There
Yeah.
you see those harmonic relationships really driving the structure toward a certain thing. Now, Chris Dunn just recently published a new book that just came out.
Yeah.
He says almost exactly the same thing that I say in the Giza Death Star Revisited. He's saying exactly the same thing.
And which is that?
That you're dealing with acoustic stepping functions. That the
Wow.
whole thing is an acoustic structure manipulating and driving acoustics for an electroacoustical purpose.
Yeah.
The only thing that Dunn and I are disagreed about is its use as a weapon,
Yeah, the intention of it.
the intention of it, right?
Right.
I maintain that if you're building a 0 point energy device like that, then inevitably you have to understand that you're creating a weapon, whether you use it that way or not.
Yeah,
But
it's a multi-purpose machine.
it's a multi-purpose machine, absolutely.
Yeah. So in the book, you talk about friends and enemies in high places,
Uh huh.
and the demon in the acre and the governance of the world.
Uh huh.
And we that tetragram is really creepy.
Yes.
And so, we're dealing with a structure that has super creepy, multi levels of super creepiness.
Yes.
You know, and so talk to me about the governance of the world.
Well, I go back to something I said in the original Giza Death Star book, and it's true. I have never felt comfortable either looking at or contemplating the Great Pyramid. That structure gives me the creeps, and it always has, as far back as I remember.
It lacks all human feeling.
It lacks all human feeling. And I realize that that puts me in a very minority crowd because most people think, "Oh, isn't this wonderful?" And blah blah blah. No, I don't think it's wonderful at all. I've never thought that. So, in a certain sense, my books were an attempt to rationalize why did I have that strange reaction to this structure, and very few other people do. Um, one reason that I think that creepiness is there is an old esoteric occult tradition that not
Not
only
only
not only do the planets in the solar system have their own angelic guardians or overseers, but that entire nations and regions on this planet do. And if you look at the placement of Giza, this is something I pointed out in my books. It was first pointed out by the Scottish astronomer royal, Piazzi Smythe, who pointed out that if you look at the surface landmass of the Earth, the place where that landmass more or less intersects is smack dab at Giza. So, in other words, there are people, and I would number myself among them, who have always maintained and argued that the Great Pyramid's apex formed the prime meridian of whatever ancient society existed on this planet. It was the Greenwich mean of the ancient world. And that's true because if you measure from Giza, if you measure the placing of other megalithic sites like Angkor Wat in Cambodia or Teotihuacan or Tikal in Mesoamerica, you'll find that they lie on coordinates that are significant in relationship to Giza. In the case of Angkor Wat, almost exactly 120 degrees east of it. So Giza would appear to be a prime meridian. So the next thing is, why build a structure that is a weapon in the middle of a compound there? And then why put a demon in the Ekur in it? Well, that placing of that structure there would be the perfect place to establish the governance of the planet
right.
and to establish the mechanism by which that governance is enforced.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
The
I
British
do
Navy of its day.
now the British Navy of its day. And again, let's remember what Tesla said about his wireless power system, that once in place, it could be used to promote world peace by forcing, these are his observations, not mine, by forcing any non compliant region either by withholding power or simply destroying it with that power.
Wow.
You know, whatever
Like
you think of,
Lahaina.
yeah, well, whatever you think about Tesla, he was Mr. Globalone par excellence, and he was willing to resort to those kinds of measures to enforce it. So,
Wow.
this is precisely what I think we have with the Great Pyramid. It was a seat, that place was a seat of governance and it was a seat of enforcement.
Wow. Yeah, you wouldn't want to mess with that thing.
Not at all. Not
That's
at all.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on 155. Is there anything else you'd like to cover in the 5 minutes we have left?
I think we pretty much covered all of it. I don't know about you, but I think we did a pretty good job.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty good job. Comments down below, likes and shares, most appreciated. Joseph, tell people where they can reach you.
You can reach me via my website www.gizadestar.com. That's all one word, all lowercase, and there is a contact button there to contact me by email. Um, and then all of my books are also available off the website, so you can
Yeah, and I
go.
really encourage people to actually get and read the books because
Yeah.
there's a lot more in those books than we could ever get to in a dialogue.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And number one, and number two, even if you don't consider yourself scientific, even if you've been trained to doubt your own abilities, you may discover through the course of reading Joseph's books, but you actually can understand this stuff if you
Yep.
trust yourself enough to do it.
Yep. Absolutely.
So thanks so much for being with us today, Joseph. It's truly a pleasure.
Well,
And
thank you for having me back on, Kelly. I appreciate it.
all right, good. Yeah, have a good day. Bye
Yep.
bye.
You too. Bye bye.